If your 4070 Ti can't play at native resolution a new game at 1440p, but it can do it at 1080p, does that mean that it's a 1080p GPU? So in a weird way, in this particular game, the 4070 Ti, not really a 1440p GPU technically. If you want to have, a 1440p and 60 frames per second, you have to use DLSS and drop it to quality. And of course, remember to subscribe if you like content like this, helps the channel grow. So the other day, I put a 4090 at 4K in Alan Wake 2, and we saw that at 4K, it can't natively do it. And this is maxing out the graphics. This is going to be ultra everything, path tracing, ray tracing. Now, the question is, how about a 4070 Ti? If a 4090 is really a 1440p GPU in Alan Wake 2, does that mean that the 4070 Ti is only a 1080p GPU? Let's check it out. We're going to put a 4070 Ti at 1440p. Obviously, putting it at 4K, not going to be a good idea. This GPU is really geared towards 1440p, but can we play it natively? Let's go into the graphics settings. This is going to be, of course, Alan Wake 2. We're going to go full screen, and we're going to put it at 2560 by 1440 DLAA. That's going to make it native. Let's turn off frame generation for now, of course. And then we're going to go down. Let's turn motion blur off just because it's a little bit better to see. So everything high, ultra, high. Let's put it on high. High. Then we have obviously global reflections on high. Ray tracing, we're going to put it on high with DLSS ray reconstruction and direct lighting. And path traced, we're going to put it on high too. This isn't going to be the optimized or ideal settings for this particular GPU at 1440p. We'll see what we need to get at least 60 frames per second or more and at 1440p and what type of settings. This is just to see what the game is going to do to the GPU basically at the highest settings natively. All right, so we're going to go. Let's go and start the game up. I'm really curious how a 4070 Ti is going to handle this because 12 gigabytes of VRAM is definitely getting a little bit tight, especially in this game. We've seen it go well over even, 12 gigabytes, closer to 16 in a lot of cases. All right, so natively, let's take a look. On the upper left, we have MSI Afterburner. You could see the GPU temperature around 70, 72 degrees. This system has a 13900KS CPU, so not going to have any CPU problems there. You can see the GPU is going at 100%. Let's take a look here. The VRAM allocation, about 9,842. And in the middle is the actual VRAM that's being used. So as of right now, we're still well under the limit of 10 gigabytes, or 12 gigabytes rather, for the 4070 Ti. Take a look at the average frame rate just standing around. Looks like we're getting around 26 FPS. Actually, a really funny thing, when I was playing with the 4090 with these same settings, but at 4K, the 4090 was getting about 26 FPS. So it's almost like a 4070 Ti is the same as a 4090, but in 1440p. You see that translation? The 4090, 26 FPS at 4K, same settings, and a 4070 Ti, about 26 FPS as well with these same settings. You can see as we walk around, the VRAM allocation and the VRAM used amount certainly going up. This would certainly blow right past any 10 gigabyte GPU, especially with these type of settings. Obviously, you would have a much higher VRAM usage with 4K, but this is still pretty demanding. But you would say this is not really very playable. Like 25 FPS isn't good. This is just to show where the 4070 Ti natively is. So that means that natively, this GPU really should be at 1080p to get anything, closer to 60 FPS. Let's go in the settings. Let's see what we have to do step by step to get a little bit better performance. Let's leave it native. Let's turn on DLSS frame generation. NVIDIA has been pushing frame generation and DLSS 3, DLSS 3.5, ray reconstruction a lot more with these more recent games. In fact, they even said that native may go away and gamers are going to have to play at these other resolutions. Let's see what frame generation, which does add some latency, let's see what it does. All right, so immediately it doubles the frame rate. At native resolution, now we have around maybe 48 FPS average, and definitely feel smoother. Let's say if we ignore the frame rate counter, certainly does feel smoother. This game does look really cool with ray tracing and path tracing, by the way. Look at all the lighting effects that you have when you have the little shimmering light. When there's water on the ground, it does look very, very nice. So now, we're reaching average 47 FPS. So that certainly does give you a pretty decent bump, almost twice the frame rate. I think you could almost play it at this frame rate when it seems like this, when it's slow and you're just moving around. It does feel fairly smooth if we look at the frame time that's going on here. The right underneath the frame time graph, you could see that there aren't any like major judders or spikes or anything like that, indicating that overall it certainly is pretty smooth. Visually, even with the frame generation on, you can't really see those interpolated frames, and this game's too slow in terms of its action to be able to tell any latency issues. So the VRAM amount, you can see it's well over 10 gigabytes utilized now. So you can tell that the 12 gigabytes of VRAM definitely is being pushed even at 1440p with this particular game. So let's see what happens if we drop it down to quality, 1707 by 960 instead of 2560 by 1440 DLAA. So no longer native. But remember, DLSS is going to be doing its AI magic and upscaling and sharpening and all these things. The settings, as we can see here, still the exact same thing. We still have high on everything. Path tracing is on. Obviously, you can, raise your frame rates a lot by not having path tracing. We'll see what that looks like a little bit later as well. And, taking off ray tracing in general, you're going to get more frames. But a game like this with a GPU like a 4070 Ti, you want to experience what it's going to look like with these higher settings, and hopefully that's the idea behind DLSS and things like that to allow us to achieve it. So let's see how much of an improvement we get if DLSS 3.5 as it is with frame generation, and we drop down to quality, which I believe should still look pretty good. We'll let the frame rates adjust themselves a bit here. All right, so you can see we're reaching around 75, 76 frames per second. So 72 average. So almost tripling the native frame rate. So I guess you could say DLSS 3 with frame generation, certainly for frame rates, and it does feel smoother. That is definitely pretty impressive in a game like this. And as I look around and in front of me, as I look at the monitor, I honestly do not notice any type of drawback from having it on quality. It still looks pretty sharp. It's not like you're going to a much lower resolution. It looks pretty good. The GPU still being used almost 100%. The CPU somewhat as well, 18, 20%. Obviously, DLSS does put a little more, strain on the CPU at times as well. Overall, looks really good. The frame time is very smooth. So I would say exactly like the 4090 at 4K. To have the best experience, in my opinion, you do need to have DLSS on with frame generation and put it down to quality. 4090 couldn't really do native very well at 4K. It can do native at 1440p, obviously. That's basically what quality is at 4K with DLSS. But likewise, the 4070 Ti really can't do 1440p natively without very low frame rates. So with these settings, if you drop it down, then the 4070 Ti gets well over 60 FPS. We're in the 70s, and then basically you're talking about almost triple the frame rate. And obviously this is going to be with path tracing and ray tracing, but that shows you that if this was a 1080p monitor to begin with, the 4070 Ti would then be at home natively with the proper frame rates that we expect. So in a weird way, in this particular game, the 4070 Ti, not really a 1440p GPU. Technically, if you want to have, a 1440p and 60 frames per second, you have to use DLSS and drop it to quality, which gets it down closer to something like 1080p. So it's kind of a 1080p GPU in this particular game. Obviously, this is just a test of these particular settings. You can, of course, reduce everything. We're going to try that now. So let's drop it down to native. Let's turn off frame generation. And remember, when we did this with the highest settings, we were getting 25 FPS at 1440p. Let's go down Let's see if we just turn off path tracing. We'll leave ray tracing on, turn off path tracing. Let's see what that does to our frame rates in this exact same scene. All right, so we're like 35 FPS. So it looks like we get maybe a 10 FPS hit from path tracing, which is significant in this lower, frame rate already. So let's go a little further. Let's say if you don't want any ray tracing at all, or you just want to turn it all off, let's turn off both ray tracing and path tracing, and everything else we're leaving on high or ultra, and it's still native, and we're not using frame generation. Let's see just how much that ray tracing and path tracing are causing issues here. All right, so you can see we're at 58, 57 FPS roughly on average. So you could say that at 1440p with no ray tracing, this barely hits 60 frames per second. That's still pretty low because now it's no ray tracing. This is native performance with no ray tracing. And looking visually on the screen, I mean, you do have some sunlight and some reflections here. You can't tell too much on this particular scene that ray tracing is missing. So I think you would be more than fine playing it like this. It still looks pretty nice with the regular reflections and the light and things like that. But obviously a game like this, you probably would want to do path tracing and ray tracing and then use DLSS. That's probably where you're going to get the best visuals. But even natively without ray tracing, struggling to hit 60 frames per second. Now, if we turn on frame generation without ray tracing, you can see we get up over 100 frames per second. Immediately feels smoother. As I look around, definitely reached the new point in terms of smoothness that we didn't have before. So, but you don't have ray tracing. And then obviously I don't think you would need to adjust it down to quality or anything like that. But if you did, and you're going to get really high frame rates, over 120 frame rates, which is, more than fine for this game. That's like, it's hard to tell the difference between 100 and 120 in this particular game. So I think the ideal settings that I would have if I were playing this game, I would leave it on quality with frame generation. And then I would turn on ray tracing, and I would turn on path tracing. Path tracing on high, ray tracing high. Basically, I would put everything on high and ultra, but I would leave it with DLSS frame generation, as well as having it go down to quality, which is going to bring it under 1440p. But then DLSS does a pretty good job at sharpening and make it look better. And you can see, the light maybe looks a little better. You can see on the car here, you have some more reflections that maybe would be benefited by path tracing and ray tracing. There are other scenes, like especially when you're walking through town, that you can tell this much better. You can see reflections of little puddles and things like that. This particular scene's already a little bit darker, but you can see well over 70 FPS with path tracing and ray tracing at 1440p. These are the settings I would use to play this game if I were playing at this exact resolution. But you can tell natively 1440p, not really going to work it for the 4070 Ti. You'd have to drop down to 1080p. All right, guys, let me know what you think. Let me know what other GPUs you'd like to see in this particular game and see what you need to do to get them playable. Remember to subscribe, and I'll see you guys on the next video.